It's strange, isn't it? The louder someone is, the more we listen. The deeper someone thinks, the quicker we forget them. We claim to value humility, depth, and wisdom, but in practice we reward something else entirely. The spotlight doesn't follow the quiet mind. It chases the confident pose, the curated image, the echo of self-importance. Narcissists, the self-obsessed performers, don't just rise on their own. We lift them. We like their certainty. We share their sound bites. And meanwhile, the wise, those who speak with nuance, who ask uncomfortable questions, who don't sell themselves like products, are buried under the noise. This isn't just a crisis of leadership. It's a reflection of us. We've turned admiration into a mirror, not of virtue, but of spectacle. And if we want to understand how we got here, we have to stop asking what narcissists are doing and start asking what we've built around them. Because this isn't just about personality, it's about culture. And to understand that culture, we need to look deeper, not just at behavior, but at the emotional soil that lets narcissism grow and the silent, unseen ways we keep watering it. It's easy to blame the narcissists for their rise, but the harder truth is this: we're the ones who give them the microphone, because somewhere along the way, we started confusing volume with value. When someone speaks boldly, we assume they must know something. When they carry themselves with certainty, we feel safe, even when the facts don't follow. That's not just a cultural flaw, it's a psychological reflex. There's something called the illusory superiority bias. It's our tendency to overestimate competence when it's paired with confidence. In other words, we're wired to believe that someone who looks sure of themselves must be right. And that bias has shaped more than just conversations. It's shaped history. Time and again, leaders have risen not through depth or vision, but through sheer presence. They didn't whisper hard truths, they shouted comforting lies. They simplified the world into heroes and villains, into black and white, and in the process gained something far more powerful than wisdom: loyalty. And loyalty, once emotionally rooted, becomes nearly unbreakable. Think of the ones we remember, the booming voices, the dramatic promises, the slogans etched into memory. It wasn't always policy that won the people, it was performance, because most people aren't just looking for answers, they're looking for certainty. And certainty, even when false, feels like a relief. It silences doubt, it quiets fear, it replaces the complexity of real leadership with the comfort of someone who sounds like they know. So when a narcissist steps in, brimming with conviction, unbothered by nuance, they don't have to earn attention, they command it. We're drawn to them, not because we admire their wisdom, but because their certainty gives us something to hold on to in a world that often feels too uncertain to bear. But this is the danger. When we treat confidence as credibility, we don't just empower the loudest voice, we start muting the quiet ones, the thoughtful ones, the ones who hesitate not because they're unsure, but because they care enough to think. And so, the stage fills with performers, while the philosophers are left in the wings. And yet these performers don't rise on charisma alone. They rise because we show up, as their audience. A narcissist doesn't gain power in isolation. They gain it through performance, and performance needs an audience. They learn how to read a room, or a comment section, or a nation. They sense what we want before we know it ourselves. And then they reflect it back with just enough charm or outrage to feel magnetic. This is the psychology of mirroring. Narcissists don't lead with vision, they lead with reflection. They don't show us who they are. They show us who we want to be, or who we want to blame. Not the best parts of us, but the most vulnerable. Our fears, our need to feel important, our longing to feel right. Even Carl Jung, nearly a century ago, warned of this dynamic. He wrote, "The larger the crowd, the more negligible the individual becomes." Because in a crowd, the narcissist becomes a vessel. They absorb projection, they give shape to fantasy. They don't need to speak the truth, they just need to speak loudly enough to echo the room. And in the digital age, the room has no walls. Because now, we don't just follow these performances, we amplify them. Social media didn't just connect us, it gamified our attention. Every post is a pitch, every like a form of applause, every comment a little burst of dopamine. In that world, the algorithm rewards not the deepest thought, but the fastest reaction. And that's where narcissists thrive. Not because they deceive the system, but because they are the system. Predictable, emotional, addictive. Psychologists call this narcissistic supply, the endless hunger for attention, validation, and emotional energy. It's not just about being seen, it's about being fed. And every time we click, share, argue, or obsess, we're feeding the performance. But here's the thing, that doesn't make us helpless. It makes us responsible. Because in this new economy of attention, every click is a vote. Every view, a form of power. And the more we reward manipulation, the more we ensure the manipulator returns to center stage. And yet, not everyone plays that game. Some choose to speak slower, think deeper. But in a world addicted to immediacy, that choice often comes at a cost. Because in a culture trained to crave volume, stillness often goes unnoticed. Wisdom doesn't arrive with fireworks. It arrives like a quiet knock, one that's easy to miss when the room is full of noise. The problem isn't that wisdom has disappeared, it's that most people have never been taught how to recognize it. In today's culture, speed is seductive. The faster something feels, the more persuasive it seems. And wisdom, by nature, isn't fast. It pauses, it doubts, it unfolds. We live in a world designed around cognitive ease, a psychological principle that explains why we gravitate toward ideas that are simple, fluent, and easy to process. If a message is catchy or familiar, we're more likely to believe it, even if it's wrong. If it's complex or slow, we're more likely to dismiss it, even if it's true. This is why the voice of wisdom, which often speaks in questions rather than declarations, struggles to compete with the voice that repeats a lie with confidence. The wise ask you to sit with uncertainty. The narcissist offers certainty even when it's false. And in a fast-paced, overstimulated world, certainty feels like a gift. But that gift comes at a cost. When we ignore wisdom, we don't just miss out on truth. We lose the tools that help us grow. Think of Socrates, a man who didn't preach but questioned. He didn't flatter the public, he challenged them. And for that, Athens gave him a death sentence. Carl Jung was dismissed by many in his time, precisely because he didn't simplify the psyche. He respected its complexity. He didn't give easy answers. He gave people a mirror they didn't always want. Even today, public intellectuals and moral philosophers are often sidelined, not because they're wrong, but because they take too long to explain why they're right. This is the painful truth. Narcissism is fast food. Wisdom is a slow meal. And in a society hooked on speed, the slowest voice is the first to be ignored. But when you keep tuning out that voice, the impact doesn't stay abstract. It doesn't just lead to poor decisions or shallow leadership. It begins to shape how you relate to others, how you trust, how you connect, how you live. The damage doesn't stay on podiums or platforms. It spills into homes, workplaces, relationships, and slowly, it rewires how we experience trust, truth, and even ourselves. Because narcissism isn't just a personality trait, it's a relational wound. It thrives on manipulation, emotional withdrawal, and performance over authenticity. And the more it's celebrated in public life, the more it becomes normalized in private life. In relationships, narcissistic patterns turn affection into a tool, and intimacy into a weapon. Charm replaces care. Control replaces connection. People who grow up under the spell of a narcissist, whether it's a parent, a boss, or a public figure, often carry wounds that are hard to name. Self-doubt, confusion, the constant fear of saying the wrong thing. At work, these wounds surface as burnout, not just from long hours, but from emotional whiplash. Leaders who demand loyalty but give none, who take credit for wins and redirect blame for failures. It's not just demoralizing, it's destabilizing. And in politics, the cost becomes even more collective. When trust is betrayed again and again by those who rise on charisma but govern through chaos, people stop believing in institutions. They stop believing in each other. This is cultural trauma, the slow erosion of trust in systems, leaders, and even in dialogue itself. We become cynical, not because we want to be, but because we've been taught, again and again, that sincerity is weak, and manipulation wins. And here's the irony. The more we reward narcissists, the more disillusioned we become. And the more disillusioned we become, the more we crave someone who sounds sure again. Even when that certainty is hollow, it's a cycle that feeds on exhaustion, and the longer it runs, the more numb we get to the damage it causes. But here's the question we rarely ask. If we know this hurts us, if we can feel the cracks it leaves in our lives and in our culture, then why do we keep doing it? Maybe we feel so disconnected, disappointed, and disillusioned because we've spent too long confusing noise with depth, the loudest voice with the wisest one. And the worst part, that confusion doesn't just shape the world around us. It shapes who we become. And once that confusion sets in, it doesn't stay on the surface. It seeps into how we define strength, how we measure worth, how we decide who matters and who doesn't. From a young age, you're shown that being heard matters more than being right, not in words, but in patterns. The loudest kid in the room isn't corrected, they're obeyed. The quiet one, often overlooked. You learn, slowly but deeply, that presence equals power, and if you want to be seen, you need to project it, even if it's just an act. So you start performing confidence, not to express who you are, but to protect who you think you should be. Because when reflection is punished, silence feels dangerous. It's not just a feeling, it becomes a fear. Psychologists call this status anxiety. The fear that if you're not visibly dominant, you'll be dismissed entirely. And in a culture where image trumps insight, that fear shapes how we carry ourselves. It's not just about admiration anymore, it's about survival. As Erich Fromm once asked, if I am what I have, and if what I have is lost, who then am I? In a society that equates being seen with being valuable, this question cuts deep. So if we fail to project strength, even hollow strength, we start to believe we don't deserve to be seen at all. And that's the real danger. We don't just reward dominance, we begin to imitate it, not to lead, but to avoid being left behind. And every time we trade authenticity for performance, we bury the very qualities, patience, depth, humility, that once defined wisdom. But what happens when wisdom refuses to perform? When it doesn't shout or demand the spotlight, but simply exists with quiet conviction? In a world addicted to spectacle, that silence doesn't just go unnoticed. It gets punished, because in this culture, depth isn't just inconvenient, it's disruptive. Humility is mistaken for weakness, doubt is treated like failure, and emotional nuance laughed off as being too sensitive or out of touch. You're not just ignored for thinking deeply, you're subtly mocked for it, dismissed, labeled impractical, unrealistic, overly serious, as if depth is the problem and shallow certainty is the solution. That's not just neglect, it's erosion, the slow erosion of voices that could have offered clarity if we had only listened. Edward Snowden, for example, whether you agree with him or not, didn't shout to gain attention. He raised questions about surveillance, privacy, and power, but instead of a national conversation, he became an exile. Rachel Carson, the quiet marine biologist who warned the world about the dangers of pesticides, wasn't welcomed with open arms. She was mocked, dismissed as emotional and unscientific, simply because she dared to challenge powerful industries. The pattern is clear. We don't just elevate the loud, we exile the wise. Because the wise hesitate, they pause, not from weakness, but from responsibility. They know real answers come with uncertainty, and uncertainty doesn't trend. And in a world that values speed over thought, that kind of restraint is mistaken for irrelevance. So we reward the one who speaks first, not the one who speaks with care. We listen to the confident, even when they're wrong, and overlook the reflective, just because they don't speak in slogans. This is how anti-intellectualism sneaks in, not with aggression, but with casual dismissal, not with censorship, but with condescension. And the tragedy? Some of our greatest mistakes didn't come from listening to the wrong people, but from tuning out the ones who saw things clearly. So perhaps the question isn't, why don't the wise lead? Maybe it's this: why do we keep punishing the ones who could? And if that's the pattern we're stuck in, what would it take to finally shift it? And the first shift may not begin in institutions or elections, but in something far quieter, what we choose to admire, and what we teach others to admire too. Because what we admire is where it all begins. It's how values spread, not by force but by fascination. We watch, we copy, we internalize, and over time, we start shaping our identities around what draws praise. That's how performance becomes more desirable than presence. That's how charisma starts to outweigh character, not because we believe it's better, but because we see it rewarded again and again. But admiration is an instinct, it's a habit, and like all habits, it can be unlearned, reshaped, rebuilt. In ancient Greece, during Plato's time, public life wasn't shaped around influencers, it was shaped around philosophers. Not because they entertained, but because they questioned. Not because they dazzled, but because they revealed. In Buddhist cultures, admiration flows toward those who embody stillness, not noise, clarity, not charisma. Wisdom is honored, not for being loud, but for being true. And even today, in places where depth is still nurtured, a thoughtful teacher, a quiet leader, a gentle parent, you can see what a different kind of admiration creates. Not applause, but alignment. Not noise, but meaning. This isn't about rejecting confidence or energy. It's about expanding the lens, so that wisdom has a place too, so that a child grows up seeing patience as power, so that silence isn't mistaken for weakness, so that the next generation doesn't believe they have to shout to matter. Rewiring admiration doesn't require a movement. It requires a shift in attention. The stories we share, the voices we amplify, the values we quietly reinforce when no one's watching. Because if we want a different kind of world, we need to stop rewarding the past that broke us and start honoring the wisdom that can rebuild us. And that brings us to the final, most personal shift of all. Where does this change actually begin? Not with culture, not with politics, but with you. Because when the noise collapses and chaos takes over, we don't search for the loudest voices. We search for the steady ones, the ones who made sense all along. It's in those moments, when power fails and spectacle burns out, that the quiet voices finally rise. Not because they shout, but because they've been steady the whole time. Think of Mandela, who endured decades of silence in a prison cell and walked out not with vengeance, but with reconciliation. Gandhi, who didn't perform rage, but embodied restraint, shaking an empire with stillness. Martin Luther King Jr., who didn't comfort the powerful, but awakened their conscience. These weren't perfect men, but they were wise. And when the world came undone, people didn't follow them for charisma, they followed something deeper: integrity. Wisdom doesn't scream, it doesn't demand, it doesn't flood your feed or chase attention. It stands, it waits, it watches, and when invited, it guides. But here's the truth: wisdom doesn't force its way in, it has to be welcomed. And most of the time, we don't. Not because it's absent, but because it's uncomfortable. It asks hard questions, it demands patience, it doesn't flatter, it reflects. Still, imagine what could happen if we gave that kind of voice the same attention we give performance. If wisdom wasn't our last resort, but our first foundation. Because the wise never disappeared, they've just been muted, not by chance, but by a culture that forgot how to listen. So maybe the real question isn't, where are the wise? It's, are we finally ready to hear them? Because what we celebrate doesn't just reveal our values, it shapes them. And what we worship eventually becomes who we are. But now I want to hear from you. Have you ever admired someone only to realize later they were empty inside? And have you ever overlooked someone quiet only to discover they were the wisest person in the room? Drop your thoughts, your story, even your doubts in the comments. Because the more we share, the more we remember how to listen. And if this video made you think, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss what's coming next.